It begins with a silence no one expected. On the morning of October 17th, 1973, tankers sat idle in the Persian Gulf, pipelines slowed to a trickle, and the heartbeat of the global economy began to falter. Within days, gas stations in America ran dry. Lines of cars stretched for miles. Out-of-gas signs became symbols of fear. Factories shut down, lights dimmed, and the world that believed it had mastered growth suddenly discovered how fragile modern life truly was. This was not a war or a natural disaster. It was something far more subtle, a decision. A handful of oil ministers meeting in Kuwait and Riyadh had turned off the tap, and with it, they had changed the 20th century. To understand why the world was brought to its knees by oil, we need to step back to the decades before the shock. After World War II, oil became the lifeblood of civilization. The United States, Europe, and Japan rebuilt their economies on cheap, abundant petroleum. Highways spread across continents. Suburbs bloomed. Air travel and car culture exploded. Oil wasn't just an energy source. It was the foundation of prosperity and identity. For decades, the United States had been the largest producer, exporting to allies and dominating prices through giants like Exxon, Chevron, and Gulf Oil. But by the 1960s, America's domestic fields were aging. The balance of power began to shift. In 1960, a quiet rebellion formed in Baghdad. 5 oil-producing nations, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Venezuela, created the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. Their goal was simple: to wrest control of prices and production from Western oil companies, the so-called Seven Sisters. For years, they remained ignored. The industrialized world still assumed control. But as the 1970s approached, consumption soared and spare capacity vanished. The global system had become dependent on Middle Eastern oil and dangerously complacent about it. By 1973, the world was a powder keg of politics and energy. The Yom Kippur War erupted in October when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. The United States quickly backed Israel with weapons and supplies, angering Arab nations that saw oil as their most powerful weapon. Under the leadership of Saudi oil minister Ahmed Zaki Yamani and King Faisal, OPEC's Arab members decided to strike back not with armies, but with barrels. They announced an embargo on countries supporting Israel, chiefly the United States and its allies, and simultaneously cut production. Overnight, the flow of oil that powered Western industry was reduced by nearly a quarter. At first, Western leaders underestimated the move. Oil had always been cheap and reliable. But this time, the producers held the upper hand. Prices quadrupled in months, from $3 a barrel to nearly $12. Gasoline doubled at the pump. Inflation surged, stock markets crashed, and for the first time since the Great Depression, the modern economy faced a new kind of crisis. Not from scarcity of goods, but from scarcity of energy. The shock spread like a chain reaction. In the United States, President Richard Nixon declared a national emergency. He lowered speed limits to save fuel, called for new pipelines, and even asked Americans to turn off Christmas lights. Europe rationed gasoline. In Britain, a 3-day workweek was introduced to conserve power. Japan, with no domestic oil to fall back on, plunged into panic. The post-war promise of endless growth had been shattered by a single resource. Economists coined a new, unnerving word: stagflation, a mix of stagnant growth and rising prices that defied all previous theories. Beneath the panic, a new global order was forming. The oil-producing nations of OPEC found themselves swimming in money. Petrodollars flooded the banks of London, New York, and Zurich as oil revenues multiplied. With newfound wealth, Saudi Arabia built modern cities from the desert. Iran, under the Shah, embarked on massive industrial projects. The balance of global power shifted south and east. For the first time in a century, the Western world realized that energy dependence meant vulnerability. Oil had become both a weapon and a mirror, revealing the imbalance at the heart of modern civilization. The crisis didn't end quickly. Even after the Yom Kippur War ended and the embargo was lifted in March 1974, prices never returned to their old levels. The world had crossed a threshold. Inflation persisted, unemployment rose, and a sense of decline haunted the industrialized nations. The dollar, already weakened by America's decision to abandon the gold standard in 1971, came under even more strain. Energy became the new currency of power, and control over it became a strategic obsession. In Washington, a new doctrine took shape: energy security. The U.S. launched the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, designed to store hundreds of millions of barrels underground for emergencies. Japan and Europe began investing in nuclear power and fuel efficiency. Car companies downsized engines and invented compact models. Even thermostats and insulation became political issues. For a generation raised on abundance, conservation was the new patriotism. But the underlying addiction didn't disappear. As the decade wore on, Western economies adjusted to higher prices but never weaned themselves off oil. OPEC itself fractured. Some members cheated on quotas, others sought closer ties with Western banks and corporations. Meanwhile, new sources emerged. Alaska's North Slope, the North Sea, Nigeria, softening OPEC's dominance. For a brief moment, the balance seemed restored, but the illusion of control was temporary. Then came the second shock. In 1979, revolution erupted in Iran, toppling the Shah, the West's key ally, and plunging production into chaos. Panic returned to markets. Lines at gas stations stretched again. Prices doubled, hitting $40 a barrel. But this time the world's response was different. The fear that once belonged to oil consumers shifted to oil producers. Iran's turmoil showed that political instability could be as dangerous as embargoes. Governments began rethinking alliances, and militarization of the Persian Gulf intensified. The Carter Doctrine of 1980 declared that the U.S. would use force if necessary to protect Middle Eastern oil routes, a policy that would define decades of foreign intervention. By the early 1980s, after years of inflation, recession, and geopolitical tension, the system finally began to stabilize, but at a cost. The global economy had been rewired. The oil shocks forced nations to diversify energy sources, modernize infrastructure, and rethink consumption itself. Europe turned to nuclear and renewables. Japan invested heavily in efficiency and electronics. The United States, under Ronald Reagan, deregulated energy markets and pursued new drilling. OPEC, once the master of the world's energy, found itself divided and weakened. The cycle of boom and bust had begun. The long-term consequences of the oil shocks reached far beyond energy. They reshaped the financial system. Petrodollar recycling, the flow of oil revenue into Western banks, created vast pools of capital that fueled lending to developing nations. That same capital later contributed to the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s. The shocks also accelerated inflation and debt in industrialized countries, prompting central banks to assert independence and raise interest rates, setting the stage for decades of monetary policy centered on inflation control. Even the modern environmental movement was galvanized. As smog, pollution, and oil spills made headlines, a new awareness took root. That energy dependence carried ecological as well as economic risk. The oil crisis was not just a story of scarcity, it was a story of power. In 1973, oil-producing nations discovered they could change history with a decision, not a weapon. Consumers learned that the invisible network of trade and trust that kept the world running could break overnight. And markets realized that price is never just about supply, it's about belief. The fixes that followed were partial and often short-sighted. Governments built reserves, improved efficiency, and diversified energy, but they never truly changed behavior. The 1970s taught the world that energy security meant vulnerability shared by all. Yet within a few decades, new complacencies arose. SUVs replaced small cars. Economies grew dependent on cheap imports again. And while oil's dominance eventually gave way to new energy forms, its legacy remains embedded in everything, from geopolitics to climate policy. The story of the 1970s oil shock is a story of dependence and illusion. Humanity discovered that modern power rests not only on technology or armies, but on energy and the trust that fuels it. When that trust breaks, so does everything built upon it. Three truths remain. First, no empire, whether industrial or digital, can survive if it forgets the limits of its resources. Second, energy is never just a commodity. It's the architecture of civilization. And third, crises don't just happen. They are built, one assumption at a time, until reality catches up. The oil shock ended half a century ago, but its shadow still stretches across our world. Every time prices rise, every time a pipeline is blocked, or a war flares near an oil field, we are reminded that energy remains the foundation of power and the fault line of modern life. If this story made you see history differently, subscribe to Economic Collapse. Because the next crisis won't come from the past. It will come from the same illusion that blinded us before. The belief that energy, like prosperity, can never run out.